Welcome back to Worth the Effort Woodworking. A few videos ago, I made this English square. I used mainly hand tools in it, and I started from a chunk of wood I chainsawed from a pecan tree. Very simple design, something somebody could make in an afternoon. The next video I did, I flipped the switch and I went into production mode using mainly power tools. And I tried to illustrate the differences in the techniques and also the similarities. A small production shop and a very small woodworking shop with simple tools you could buy from most big box stores, and how I ended up with about a 30 of the same English squares. The difference is this one hasn't been carved yet. And that's what we're going to be discussing today. Relief carving and the differences between a small shop and a production run shop. So let's get busy. Now, of those two previous videos, a lot of people will look at this one with a little bit more admiration because they think that the hand tool way takes a lot more skill. And I tried to explain in the second video where I did the production run that it wasn't that it took more skill, it just took different skills. And in today's modern age, people seem to appreciate the hand tool work because it's so foreign to them. Now, people growing up at the turn of the century, from the turn of the century forward, it seems like, at the turn of the 19th century, they'd be sticking knives like this in the hands of kids. What do we stick in the hands of kids nowadays? Tablets. I mean, a 2-year-old can figure out how to scroll, pinch, zoom, browse, all that kind of stuff fairly quickly through the tabs we are using as how my parents use a TV as a babysitter. And if you think about it, we are ingraining in them a lot of experience, a lot of skill with technology. And there's kind of this urban myth out there about that 10,000 hours to become an expert at something. Yet there's a huge learning growth spurt at the beginning. I mean, the curve is you learn a whole bunch at the start, and a lot of times you'll plateau off for a while, then you take a little step out. But towards the top, after just a little bit of time, the growth curve is a lot flatter. And becoming an expert over those 10,000 hours, it's probably those last 9,500 hours where you're just gradually learning a little bit. So the fact that we are starting out being comfortable with technology to begin with, a lot of times the production methods of machineries and nowadays CNCs seems to a lot of people to take a lot less skill. But really it's just building upon skill we have already kind of developed. We've started working on the foundation when we were a little kid playing on the little tablets. Whereas this right here seems foreign. And that is understandable. This is a chip carving knife. And in the European style of chip carving, most of us will use two knives, a plunge knife and then our main one that's going to handle 95% of the work. And to most people, you look at that, it's kind of a strange device. But I can almost guarantee that within 5 minutes to an hour, somebody could become confident enough holding and using this kind of tool, learning how to sharpen it, and understanding the grain of the wood, that they would be comfortable actually making something on their own, something creative. And this is the simplest form of relief carving, and something that you could have done this entire project with only the one knife. And the idea is you just figure out how to hold it so that you can get 3 points on the wood. I'm using 1, my knuckle, 2, and then the tip of the blade, so that it locks the angle in, that angle generally being about 60 degrees. And then you just visualize where the point is. And if you want to do a freestyle carving, just plunge it in. If you want a deeper line, you plunge a little bit deeper. You can curve it around, whatever you want. Rotate it, and then take off that relief. And then the hollow it makes creates a very nice shadow line. Then pull out towards the end. And obviously I'm a very amateur at this one, but you can see the effect. You can see how you could do letter carving, drawing, all that kind of stuff. Chip carving is actually an entire art form in itself, and that if you can learn to do one kind of cut, you can make an unlimited amount of stuff. And that is the traditional triangle. So I have my cross grain, so I'm going to start right here. I just kind of plunge it down, come back over, make the triangle going as kind of bastard grain style, and then come back in and take that final chip out. And you're left with a very nice triangle. Continue to do that one on various different shapes, and you can make a very traditional kind of carving using geometric shapes, all one triangle at a time. And if you want to get into this, there's a whole community out there. But one lady I really like on Instagram is this Tatbal Carvings. She's from Russia, but what makes her so unique is, while I learned to carve everything with this tool, she carves everything with just the plunge cut tool. Now what I used to carve all of this were gouges. Specifically, I used a V-gouge to carve out all the letters, and basically I'm just tapping it on back, and the V-gouge does a lot of what you would do. Let me secure this down. A V-gouge does a lot of what you would do with that chip carving knife, except it does it on both sides, and it's kind of a little bit easier to curve around. You fly it somewhat like a plane. Then I used some gouges over some very basic techniques that I saw Peter Follansbee use. Basically, I would come over, tap it one way, reverse it, tap it the other way. That creates a kind of S, and then use the same gouge starting at one corner and just curving out a chunk on one side, creating that chip, and then doing the same exact thing on the other side. And it creates a shadow effect that is a nice decoration for a lot of our works. See how that kind of turns out that way? That's what I did on all of these corners. You just repeat the process and you can get real nice decorations. You see, the learning curve was just about holding the tool, learning how to sharpen it, and then utilizing this tool shape to create other things. For example, a little flower. Basically, I have a steeper radius tool that I just punched all the way around to make the center, and then I can use this shape, the same shape I used for making those X-Carves, to create the little flower petals. Basically, compress the wood fibers, and then using that same shape, starting at the tip, and just relieving that out so light will show around it. Fairly simple. And to add a little pizzazz, we return to our stab tool to add little things for our flower petals. This, in my opinion, is real easy for people to learn. The techniques are simple and somewhat intuitive once you just spend maybe an hour playing around with the tool. The learning curve on tools such as this is really steep. You can become proficient really quickly, and you don't have to spend much money. I mean, I can guarantee this little tool right here, I'll be using well past the time that my bandsaw, CNCs, routers, all go kaputs. And that's why in a small shop, when you are just making one thing at a time, just spending a couple hours to learn a new skill makes a lot of sense, both financially and just the personal reward you'll get out of your work. But I can't imagine doing 30 of these in any time span that would be profitable. And that's why you turn to small shop production techniques. And in carving all those English squares, because what I want to do is have a couple different designs going across the legs, and then leave that center section open so I can customize it with the purchaser's last name or some artwork or even company logos. And the CNC is the perfect machine for that, as long as I have the foundation skills to use it. Now I want you to think about that. With a hand chisel or a hand tool, somebody that's never woodworked before, I can show them how to sharpen it, I can show them how to hold it, I can show them how to anchor the work so that they can use a tool safely, and then I can let them to begin learning. From that basement foundation to getting them ramped up that learning curve, it's a very quick transition. But when you're talking about stuff like this, where a lot of guys nowadays people think, well, I want to make a sign, I want to carve my name in something, I want to do something, yada yada yada, anything to deal with carving or cutting out pieces, a lot of people's first reaction is they need to start looking at CNCs. And that's basically because of the foundation of knowledge that they've developed. They feel comfortable in that one. And think about that. In order to run a CNC machine, you first need to learn how to turn on a computer. And I say that in all seriousness, even to this audience here that's watching YouTube over the internet. I mean, when I was in high school, typing classes was really on a typewriter. We had the typing ribbon and all that kind of stuff. You didn't have word processors. In fact, the class was called typing, not keyboarding. And in that generation, we really did have to learn how to turn on and off the computer. I mean, just finding the on button was difficult a lot of times because that little symbol, we didn't know what that meant. And then why do you have to go to the start button to turn it off? Or if you want to eject your floppy disk or CD or DVD, why do you drag it to the trash can? Will that erase the data? I mean, that's the kind of knowledge we had to start out with. Not to mention, word processors, all that kind of stuff. That's an entire environment of skill you need to develop. And then whenever you come over to the CNC machine, not only do you have to work with GUI interfaces over the internet, you have to understand different programs. Well, a lot of programs that do certain things, once you learn one, it's easy to learn the other because you are in that environment. All they do is basically change the icons for the tools and the labels for them. But you have to have these skills and knowledge in that environment. And heaven forbid you need to create the artwork that you want to carve. Now you either have to learn Adobe's or some kind of vector artwork or Photoshop or something like that, or you have to be adept at stealing the images off of Google and modifying them. What I'm trying to say here is there is a lot of skill necessary, a lot of knowledge necessary before you can get to the point where you can start learning on this machine. And once you get to that point, now all of a sudden there's a lot more things you need to think about. For example, I want my carvings to as closely resemble something hand done as possible. Very traditional carving. And when you're doing that, when you're going to be turning to what they call V-bits, kind of makes sense when you look at them. But there are a lot of different styles of V-bits. This one right here has a 60-degree angle, meaning this angle right here, that right there is 60 degrees. And then you have 90-degree angles, and they go quite a bit down from there. A traditional carving bit, what they call end mills on CNCs, has these flat or kind of V-notch bottoms on them, or they're round if you're doing smooth 3D carvings. And these just give you a very, I like to call it pixelated look, because whenever they're cutting down into stuff, they're going to cut at a very kind of notchy level, making it look like an old 16-bit arcade game. So that would make it obviously look like it came off of a CNC machine. Where these right here, they can carve so that it's kind of coming down to a point. And this angle, being 60 degrees, is pretty much the angle they teach you to hold your knife. So me personally, I want to use a 60-degree one. But there are considerations here. In order to get a line thickness, I have to come up on the bit a certain amount. Otherwise, the bottom of it will be jagged. It won't be this nice kind of point. And what I'm talking about is when it cuts into the wood, in order to get a line this wide, I have to make the bit come down that far. So that limits me. Because the frames I'm carving on, use a lap joint for the cross member and a bridle joint for this. And that bridle joint only allows me a certain amount of depth before the cross grain will show up. Now, will the customer notice that in the carving? Probably not, but I want to make sure that I don't go into this second board right here where I'm carving down this direction, or this one right here. So any artwork I do, I have to take into consideration I have a thickness of line limit that I can use in these sections. And with that knowledge, I might be using the 90-degree bit, because a 90-degree bit can create a wider line at a shorter depth. Or I just need to take into consideration in my design that the tops and those two little points on the legs will not have very thick lines, which is probably what I'm going to do, because I really do want to use a 60-degree V-bit, because that will most resemble what a hand-carved work would do, the natural tool angles. Now I'm going to create my artwork in a program called Illustrator, because that's an environment I'm comfortable with. And once I create that line art that I want to transfer to the wood, I'll put that into a program called Aspire, which is a new program that I'm having to learn for this CNC machine. So I have a bit of a problem when people think that these don't require a lot of skill. They require a lot of foundational knowledge, a lot more than we require for hand tool woodworking. And they require some skill in program manipulation. It's still eye-hand coordination. The fact that it's happening with a mouse isn't that big a deal. And it does take into account a lot of 3D conceptualization in your brain. Just like when I'm using this device, I have to picture where the tip is inside the wood. But despite all that knowledge, prep work, education, training, design work, artistic work, there's one simple thing about machines like that that really brings me back to simple knives over and over and over. Hand tools, the least amount of education you need to make a lot of stuff most times. And that's simply this. That machine, I'm limited to that 60-degree bit. And while basic training has you holding the knives right at 60 degrees to make most of your cut, there are opportunities here where I can drop it down to about 33 degrees or 30 degrees, bring it back up to 90 degrees to affect how shadow plays over those edges. I'm not locked into a straight 60 degrees. And if you look at really talented chip carvers or other kinds of carvers, they play with those knife angles. A CNC machine like that, I'm limited to whatever size bit I put into it. And it's those limitations when you're doing production runs or dealing with machineries that really does open up a lot of creativity in problem solving, so that you can get around them as best you can so that you don't notice that it's done by a machine. But let's look at some of these examples of how I work through that problem to get as close as I can to the results of using just a plain knife. I started out working out all my design ideas in MDF, and when I got a really crisp line, a crisp shape I liked, that's when I moved to my test pieces. These are a bunch of seconds. For example, this one had a little bit of a gap right there, so I didn't want to sell this one, so I just used it to test things out. And this is the first one I did, and what was the first shock I had was, while I could get it perfect in MDF, all of a sudden when you came over to wood, we had to deal with grain. As always, it always comes back to working with the grain. So you got tear out, chip out, you got shavings that came off. It turned really rough. So the designs that I had that worked great in a uniform substrate like MDF just wasn't going to work with hard maple. And you can also notice slight burning. If I zoom in, you can see on the every time it went into end grain, you got a little bit of burning. End grain caused burning from the bit, which told me that even though this bit which I basically stopped using it after a couple more practicing, didn't have much life on it. It was pretty much burned up. Now I did sharpen it for subsequent batches, and you can tell that they came out a little bit cleaner as far as the cuts, but there was still just a slight bit of burning. And the farther along in the cut it went, the more the burning happened. So after spending a little bit more time sharpening this very bit, you can see the burning went away, but I'm still getting the roughness of going whenever you're changing direction along the grain pattern, because this is a circular bit going uphill and downhill against a grain. So those are things that you, when you're working with this kind of tool, you had to take into consideration the speed of rotation, how quickly it went through the wood. And in actuality, by speeding up its path through the wood so it would take a bigger chip, I was able to clean up a lot of this cutting action. So that you can see in the subsequent ones, they got cleaner and cleaner as I adjusted the speed, the depth, the plunge rate, all that kind of stuff in my cutting. Also, I bought a new bit, and I got a carbide bit from Whiteside. Much nicer cutting. You come over to this next one. I started going out and I wanted to practice using other people's logos and such. So one of the people I follow on Instagram is RR Buildings. So I grabbed his logo and see what I could do with it. I also started playing around with fonts, different kinds of fonts. And you can see the finer bit, not only did it make cleaner lines, but it was a lot smoother. But then I came back to these diamond shapes, the hallmark of chip carving. And even with a very brand new bit, I got a little bit of burning, which means that even with this bit, I had to change speed rates, change feed rates, change plunge rates. Now Jay Bates, I contacted him and he sent me his artwork in a vector file, and man, did his artwork come out a lot cleaner once I had a real file to work with, but still using the same bit, further refining plunge rates, speed rates each time. But if you notice, I started getting a lot cleaner cuts, though there's a slight bit of tear out. Though there's a slight variation in that the tool started to vibrate. So you can see in these cuts, they are not as smooth a curve as I would like, even though the end grain finish is pretty good. April Wilkerson is local to me. So just as practice, I stole her image off of YouTube so that I could practice creating the vectors from a bitmap, and that's another software aspect. FYI, I was using the live trace function in Illustrator to do that one. And you can tell the difference, because unlike Jay Bates, you see these little lines that popped up. Those were created by anchor points, so to speak, in the program that were created because it was a bitmap. It was a bunch of pixels. It wasn't a mathematical measurement of a curve. It's just not quite as smooth. And this told me that I probably need to get vector arts if I ever want to do people's logo. I also want you to notice something. These little exits, see how they're now rounded? Let's look at her name. It's not as smooth of entry. How about on these triangles? We don't have a point coming out, because whenever they use a V-bit, basically it draws the bit out to create that point. And unfortunately, this brand new bit that I just bought, they're only about $15, I accidentally dropped on the bed and it chipped out the very tip a tad bit. Can you see it? It doesn't come quite to a point. But the advantage of that, look at this baseline on this eye on the Wilkerdoodles. See how that is now flat? Because it had a slight flatness to it, as the bit went back and forth, it created a nice smooth flat surface right there for the reflections. Whereas if we look over here at Jay Bates's name, if you look at the base, or better yet, RR Buildings, you see a double line in there. That's because the bit went on one side to create a smooth surface, and then it went on the other side. So there's a slight pyramid in the middle because it didn't have that slightly flat roundness on bottom. So I need to now decide, do I want to maybe flatten them on purpose and not worry about getting a perfect triangle as if it came in as a knife? Or do I just keep moving on with a sharp bit? In all of these, I'm probably going to have to come in, and if I just use the knife, I can get out these little bits of trash on each one of them. Just might take a little bit of time to go through them. All of these were basically straight off of the machine, and I just hand sanded them a little bit, so they all might have a little bit of trash still in them. But here's another logo that I kind of stole from the internet and manipulated as best I could with the software. And you can tell in the name, because I was now using that flattened tip bit, I couldn't get as crisp a line as the text. It comes out okay, it's readable, but it does make the wording right there a little bit nicer in my opinion. Finally, the last one, and you can tell I use a different font on this one, and like on this D, you see that center point coming through where it's a little bit lower, and me just playing around with different fonts to figure out which one would be best in production work. I kind of like this one the best, but the one I use for RR buildings really did turn out nice. But isn't that the situation whenever you're doing machine work or production work? You have quite a bit of testing to do, test fitting stuff, or if you're getting into something new. I mean, I've practiced before, not counting the stuff I did on MDF where I got it to where it's just working right. I've now carved 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 3 I threw away. 12 of these items, each one taking about an hour and a half to 2 hours for the machine to do the work. It just takes time, practice, experimentation. But once you get it down, it's repeatable. It's even modifiable. I can put people's different names and stuff like that and have the machine doing work while I'm doing something else. But it always comes down to, are you really going to want to be a production woodworker? If you're only making 1 or 2 items, a couple chairs or something like that, is it worth setting up all those jigs? I mean, I made pretty much the same exact thing in a couple hours on a weekend with hand tools. And if I had never carved before in my life, I guarantee you could do at least this kind of quality of work with a simple knife and maybe an hour's worth of practice in front of the TV while watching a football game or something like that. There's a lot of reward in doing it the simple way. Just grabbing a knife, grabbing a chisel, and having at it. But there's not very many ways you can earn a living nowadays doing that, especially if you're just starting out and you haven't had the years of experience it takes to do it well fast. There's a difference between doing it well and doing it well fast. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please like, favorite, subscribe. Do all those social medias. And yes, on my website, not only do I have a blog, which I'm going to be doing a lot more with in the near future, but I also have an online store where I will be selling merchandise like this. So you can get yourself a fully functional English or framing square, or if you just want a piece of shop art, something with your logo and name on it. Visit that website. All those sales really help subsidize me making videos like this for you. And I always want you to remember that it is always worth the effort to learn, create, and share with others. Y'all be safe and have fun.